Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so that you know when live we go. Hello everyone, welcome to today's DNS session. We will have a discussion on today's newspaper, The Hindu, Delhi edition dated 13 September 2021. We shall discuss articles important for civil service examination and will try to meet the demand of the exam. There is an article in today's newspaper which has a headline, Haryana government says uncultivable land outside Old Gurugram, not Aravalis. See, Aravalli range has been consistently in news since last few years. There has been controversy regarding which area has to be included in the region of Aravalli for the purpose of conservation, but those state government regulations will not get into. We'll have a general discussion on Aravalli from the examination perspective. Aravalli range, as you would know, is a mountain range in northwestern India running approximately 670 km. The direction is from northeast to southwest. The expanse of Aravalli range covers Delhi, Haryana, a good part of Rajasthan, and it finally ends in Gujarat. For the prelims examination, you must be aware that the peak reaches the maximum height in the southwestern region. The highest peak of Aravalli is Guru Shikhar, near Mount Abu. Aravalli in the northwestern region, and by the time it comes to Delhi, it gets inundated, covered by the large swathe of young alluvium deposits. And it's only occasionally visible as hillocks, small hills, like the Raisina Hill. And elevation in this region is quite low, around 400 to 600 meters. But it's very important for you to know that Aravalli range does not end here. It does not end at Delhi. It travels beyond and go further right till Haridwar, right here. But the extension of Aravalli from Delhi to Haridwar is underground. So Aravalli is not visible in Uttar Pradesh. And this hidden limb of Aravalli from Delhi to Haridwar creates a watershed, a divide between the drainage of rivers of Ganga and Indus. See, Aravalli range is considered to be the oldest fold mountain system in the world. Mountain systems are considered as young or old or oldest depending upon whether they are growing or not. For example, you must have heard that Himalayas are young fold mountain because the height of Himalaya is still rising. The plate which are pushing against each other are still continuing to push and Himalayas are still rising. But when this subduction process between the plates has stopped and the mountain is still not rising, but by the natural process of erosion and withering, its height is decreasing, it's considered as an old mountain. That's how young and old are defined. Fold mountains are of course those which are formed by folded crust. When the tectonic plates collide with each other, one of them gets inside the other, depending upon the density. The denser one will manage to get inside. Under the pressure and heat, it will melt and the lava will come out, get deposited, resulting in the formation of mountain. So the earth crust gets folded and the resulting mountain is called as fold mountain, formed by folded crust. So fold mountains are a result of plate tectonics. There are various theories that have been put forward for the formation of Aravalis, but we will stay clear of them. We will not get caught up in the convoluted theories. We'll note only what is necessary, important. And what's necessary and important is that Aravalis date back to millions of years. One good accepted estimation is around 200 million years. See, one of the theory is when the Indian mainland plate, the Indian plate collided with the Eurasian plate, when the first collision happened with the western northern part of the plate, the impact created the mountain of Aravalli here. But then there are other theories as well. The theory of collision of two sections, one on the right and one on the left of Aravalli. This is called as Marwar segment on the northwest of Aravalli. And this is called as Bundelkhand segment on the southeast of Aravalli. These segments are the basis, the foundation of plate tectonics. They have remained stable despite the changes in the plates. So according to many theories, Aravalli was already there before the Indian plate collided with the Eurasian plate, and hence it is very old. It is also considered as the oldest fold mountain system of the world. It used to be higher than Himalayas, but after millions of years of withering, now it is not a tall mountain. Aravalli, as we have learned, is the oldest fold mountain of the world, and it has great role to play in the history of Earth. Some 750 million years ago, a massive Malani volcanic eruption happened in the region around Jodhpur of present-day Rajasthan. During this period, the Earth was covered with ice from pole to pole. Paleontologists call this phase as the snowball Earth. With the Malani volcanic eruption, there was huge amount of flow of lava. And this perhaps was the trigger to liberate Earth from the grip of ice and eventually leading to multicellular life on the planet Earth. Aravalli, as we have learned before, was there even before the formation of Himalayas. And the Himalaya is older than the Himalayan rivers. So you can connect the dot and understand that Himalaya has played very prominent role in shaping the geography of our country. Aravalli has prevented the spread of sediments brought down by fast-flowing Himalayan rivers. We have also noticed previously that Aravalli is not visible in the region of Uttar Pradesh. Aravalli is also inundated. It has been covered by the alluvial plain. So the sedimentation that has happened resulting in the great alluvial plain of India, the Indo-Gangetic plain that has been shaped by Aravalli. We also observe that Aravalli acts as a water divide between the Indus River Basin and the Ganga River Basin. So it had immense role to play in shaping geography of our country, and that has continued through time unbroken. We have evidence from carbon dating techniques that copper has been mined since 5000 BC in the Aravalli range. We have evidences to suggest that copper has been mined in the ancient Kalibangan and the Kunal settlements of Indus Valley civilization. In the current time, prominent rivers like Banas, Sahibi River, Chambal River, the tributaries of Yamuna, and the Luni River that ultimately flows into the Rann of Kutch, they originate from Aravalli. Aravalli also has an important role in deciding the spread and the direction of monsoon. The Aravalli mountain range and the hill peaks, they gently guide the monsoon clouds eastwards towards Shimla and Nainital. And this helps nurture the sub-Himalayan rivers, which ultimately feeds the North Indian plains. Aravalli also prevent the monsoon winds crossing into Pakistan and Afghanistan, enabling India to take greater benefit of monsoon. And when the winter comes and the white wind blows, it protects the fertile alluvial river valleys from the cold westerly winds from Central Asia. Aravalli also has a great role to play in the groundwater recharge system. Aravalli at the base, although is made up of extremely hard rocks, it has granite gneiss. It also has a system of quartzite rocks. But the thing is that they bear small cracks and fractures. And these fractured stones, sandstones and marbles and granites, they help regulate the flow of water and recharging of groundwater aquifers. In 2017, Central Groundwater Board conducted a study, according to which the aquifers of groundwater in Haryana and Delhi, they are interconnected. And any change in Aravalli will seriously affect that interconnectedness. Further, since they are interconnected, the mining activity, if that is polluting one side, the entire groundwater will get polluted. Aravallis are also the last barrier between the expanding desert in the northwest and the northern plains. Because of mining activities, because of deforestation, the weathering is faster. And these discontinuities are enabling the desert to expand in the northern plain. Aravalli also hosts intensively rich wildlife. You must know that there is a species of fluorescent gecko that is to be found only and only in Aravalli Hills. The Sariska Delhi Leopard Wildlife Corridor runs from the Sariska Tiger Reserve in Rajasthan to Delhi Ridge. This 200-kilometer long corridor is a very important wildlife corridor in our country. Similarly, the Southern Aravalli Leopard Wildlife Corridor. It runs from the Sariska and Ranthambore to Rann of Kutch and Gir National Park in Gujarat. Prominent and famous protected areas like Sultanpur National Park, Sariska Tiger Reserve, Ranthambore National Park, the National Chambal Wildlife Sanctuary, they all lie in the region of Aravalli. Aravalli has rich mineral deposits, but Aravalli is best known for construction material. Remember this for your prelims exam. Huge reserve of granite, marble and sandstone are found in Aravallis. Marble and sandstone from Aravalli has been used for constructing Taj Mahal during the time of Mughal. It also has been used to construct the Victoria Memorial during the time of Britishers and various other local forts and monuments. So the significance of Aravalli is huge. Its conservation is imperative. This article is from page number 6, A Global War on Terror with No Tangible Results. The article, of course, has been written in the context of global war on terrorism. Global war on terrorism, this phrase is used to refer to the US government's international military operation that was initiated after 9/11. This was the campaign of US that primarily targeted the extremist groups all across the Muslim world. The global war on terror, this phrase has the word war and it is metaphorically used. It refers to a wide range of acts that does not really constitute the meaning of the word in traditional sense. We'll do our discussion regarding this article in two parts. In the first part, we'll discuss specifically global war on terrorism of US. This, although not very important for the mains exam, will give a general understanding as to what is the criticism of US global war on terrorism. Then in part 2, that will be more important for the exam perspective, we'll discuss the ethics of war. One of the criticism of global war on terrorism of US is that it violates state sovereignty. Afghanistan was primarily invaded due to the fact that people who the US considered to be terrorists linked to 9/11 attacks are living in Afghanistan at the time and they were not handed over to US. But many suggest that dialogue and diplomacy could have been pursued in order to reach an agreement rather than rushing into the conclusion that an invasion was the only means for the US to achieve its objective. This criticism is in the light of international laws that states that other means to resolve dispute should be looked before considering an act of war. For instance, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter states that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purpose of United States. And surely it can be said that US did not exhaust all the means of negotiations and diplomacy. After 9/11 attack, United Nations Security Council drafted 2 resolutions in response to the attacks. And these resolutions contained information as to what would constitute an appropriate response for such terrorist attacks. The 2 resolutions adopted were Resolution 1368 and Resolution 1373. And both of these resolutions dealt with threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist attacks. But neither of these 2 resolutions allowed for military action, nor did they contain any aggressive language that could have been used to justify military action. So US invasion of Afghanistan surely was in conflict with the internationally laid norms. US also has been criticized for human rights violation in its global campaign, the global war on terrorism. Many investigative journalists points out that the interrogation method used by US soldiers in places and secret jails like one in Guantanamo Bay and prison developed in Abu Ghraib in Iraq, they violate international Geneva Conventions. They feel that if US uses force and behave immorally or unethically, they are no better than the militants they are countering or fighting. US, in pursuance of its global war on terrorism, started using a designation called as enemy combatant. Enemy combatant is a person who either lawfully or unlawfully engages in hostilities for other side in an armed conflict. After the September 11 attack, the term enemy combatant was used by George W. Bush administration to include an alleged member of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban being held in detention by the US government. And in this sense, enemy combatant actually refers to persons the United States regard as unlawful combatants, a category of person who do not qualify for prisoner of war status under the Geneva Convention. And that's the justification of torturous interrogation methods. It also has been alleged that the US Army practiced kidnapping or capturing people and sending them to countries where they face a higher risk of torture or abuse during interrogations. It is also alleged that US developed a network of secret jails for terror suspects And jails like one in Abu Ghraib in Iraq is only one out of many. Many have also argued that war on terrorism of US has little to do with the stated purpose. They point out that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11 attack and that the invasion of a largely secular country was carried out on the basis of faulty intelligence. US alleged that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, but no such weapon were later found. And the biggest ultimate criticism is US campaign for global war on terrorism failed to meet any long-term or any stated objective. Afghanistan has again fallen into the hands of Taliban with greater and deeper control of the country. US intervention in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, in Somalia have given rise to IS, which is now a threat for global community. Although officially not declared by US, but there has been various estimation of casualties. In one of the estimation, where the casualties all over the war zone, where US carried out global war on terrorism has been estimated. The largest category of casualty are the civilians. But this was supposed to be war on terror. On basis of these arguments, it is said that US violated international law, the international standards which are part of UN Charter, the Nuremberg standards. It's a guideline of US to determine what constitute war crimes. US is also criticized for the fact that US has set a precedent. And with this precedence, any nation could justify the invasion of any other state. Now let's discuss ethics of war from the perspective of GS paper 4. Let's begin from the beginning. In the beginning, there was a state of nature. Immanuel Kant, in his work called as Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch, has stated that the state of peace is not the state of nature, which is rather the state of war. So must the state of peace is established. Meaning the natural state of nature is not state of peace. If you leave things on its own, it will automatically get into chaos. That is a state of war. So state of peace is essentially established, meaning something has to be done about it. Maybe in the form of good governance, maybe in the form of inclusivity, maybe in the form of ethical governance, maybe in the form of equal representation. And this does not rule out the possibility of a war. So man, to get out of the natural state of nature, which is the state of chaos, a state of war, came together and laid down certain norms and signed a social contract. According to the social contract theory, people come together and they give up certain right to the sovereign authority so that the sovereign authority gets into the position of governing. But people still hold the right to overthrow sovereign authority if sovereign authority fails to protect people's interest. So government, if tyrant, can be overthrown. Now, when you can overthrow a government, you can take help of external power, like Bangladesh did. It took help from India during its War of Liberation of 1971. The principle of utilitarianism also supports violence, if and only if the intended good is much more than the harm that will be caused by violence, so that there is overall utility of the war. The modern time philosopher John Stuart Mill, one of the strongest proponents of utilitarianism, also has suggested that violence can be used. There's a very famous harm principle of John Stuart Mill. This principle resonates the same idea which in general utilitarianism does. When an action is taken, both good and bad can come out of it. But the ethical decision to choose an action will depend upon whether more good is coming or more bad is coming. That will decide the overall utility of that action. Violence also has not been denounced altogether in the Indian philosophy. Arjuna says in Mahabharata, I see no being in this world without violence. If need be for a greater good, violence can be adopted. There are many realpolitik philosophers like Kautilya, Machiavelli. According to them, the highest purpose of social political life is to attain and hold power. And in the process, assertive actions can be taken. There are many modern day realpolitik philosophies that put national interest as the summum bonum, meaning the highest end of life. Protection of national sovereignty, the national interest, is the highest end. And if need be, you can go on war against a hostile state. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, he, among many other realpolitik philosophers, have glorified the war. They consider war as an agent of change and progress. Many other philosophers and moral thinkers have asked to take action for a moral change, for ethical progress. Saint Augustine has said that peacefulness in the face of a grave wrong that could only be stopped by violence would be a sin. In Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna has asked Arjuna to raise his weapons and destroy the enemy to establish the dharma in society. In one of the very famous work of Dante, called as the Divine Comedy, the first part of that is called as Inferno. Here Dante says the darkest place in hell are reserved for those who in time of moral crisis preserve their neutrality. You must be aware that Russia and China did not participate in voting of UNSC on Afghanistan. They abstained from it. Many of the countries are silent, looking at the other side. They are not paying heed to what's going on in Afghanistan. So much of philosophy is actually sufficient for you to justify a stand of violence if greater good is coming out of it, if dharma is getting established, if there is some utility in it, if a change and progress is coming out of it. But to have a balanced stand, you must also be aware that Aristotle has said that there is no absolute moral standard, and any ethical theory must be firmly grounded in the reality of human nature and ground reality. So you cannot just go to the war on the pretext that you have to establish moral standards. Moral standards of different people, different region at different time will be different. The pretext of US to establish democracy, Taliban, despite all its lapses, you have to agree, do enjoy people's support. Else it would not have been possible to capture the entire nation in barely 10 days. So their ideology, although we may not agree with it, is acceptable to people. You cannot go on war with communist nations like Vietnam just because you do not like that form of governance. You cannot be bulldozing a small nation like Cuba just because they are not opening up their economy. Remember, moral standards are not absolute. It is also accepted that violence begets violence, and true progress can only come through peace and forgiveness. Gandhiji has said, there is no hope for the aching world except through a narrow and straight path of non-violence. And you see this happening in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, in Egypt, in Somalia. Some libertarians also argue that waging a war on terrorism is a bad idea because it elevates national security to the point that any sacrifice of human liberty and freedom, no matter how modest and small, is judged necessary. And this leads to not just an unjustified erosion of liberty, but also to a widespread climate of fear, making individuals reluctant to use their civil liberties. Libertarians have been warning against the dangers of mass monitoring enslaving the people. Thus, in all fairness, what is required is a negative attitude towards violence. It should be used only as the last resort. Wisdom and emotional intelligence are required to judge the timing and proportion of violence. It must also be proportional to the violence. It must also be proportional to the violation of human rights and moral principles. In judging the utility of the war, you have to take into account the violation of human rights and moral principles. Ultimately, the war's objective must be to re-establish peace. There is an article on page number 7, what the Q1 GDP numbers say. The thing is that recently Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation has released the GDP data for the first quarter of the fiscal year 2021-2022. Every year, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation releases 4 quarterly GDP update, which helps the economists and observers to assess the current health of Indian economy. When the ministry releases the GDP data, it has 2 categories of data. One that gives us GDP. GDP, as you understand, is the total monetary value of all final goods and services, meaning the one that are bought by the consumers over a period of time. When it's a quarterly data, that would pertain to the total monetary value of final goods and services that have been purchased by the consumers in this quarter. We are talking about the first quarter that will include 3 months, April, May and June. So GDP, you understand, is the measure of the economic growth from the demand side. Similar to GDP is GVA. GVA is gross value addition. It looks at how much value has been added in monetary terms in different sectors of economy. So GVA tracks the output. So this is concerned with the supply. This is concerned with demand. Intuitively, one may feel that supply will be equal to demand, but there's government sitting in between these two. So between what is ready to be supplied and what goes into the hands of the consumers, there is tax. Government do taxation, but then it also gives subsidies. So GDP is actually GVA plus taxes collected by the government and minus subsidies given by the government. So the difference in GDP and GVA arises because of the role of government. If the government earned more from taxes than what it has to spend on subsidies, then GDP will be higher than GVA. And on the other hand, like some oil-rich countries, if the government provides subsidies in excess of its taxes collected, the absolute level of GVA will be higher than absolute level of GDP. For India, of course, GDP will be greater than GVA. Now let's come to the most important data that the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation has put forward. In the first quarter of the current financial year, India's GDP grew by 20.1% and GVA by 18.8%. These numbers seem to be stupendous. But the catch here is the percentage that we calculate, for that we need a base. And that base has been taken on year basis. Meaning the GDP number for the first quarter of financial year 2021-2022 will be compared with the first quarter of 2020-2021. But you know what happened in the first quarter of last financial year? Economy contracted. It contracted brutally. It contracted by 24.4%. This is GDP number. GVA contracted by 22.4%. So in the growth story, huge slump happened in this quarter. That means we fell by 24.4% and now we have risen by 20.1%. But we are still falling short from where we were before the pandemic occurred. So you must immediately understand that Indian economy has not shown V-shaped recovery, meaning sharp slump in the growth rate and sharp rebound back. This has not happened. In fact, if you compare the number with the fourth quarter of last year, economy has shown contraction of 17%, meaning we are performing poorly by 17% if we compare our performance of this quarter with the last quarter of last financial year or just the preceding quarter. The numbers also tells us that in absolute terms, our economy is worse by 9.2%. Compared to the pre-COVID era, if we do the year-on-year comparison with the first quarter of 2019-20. So there's nothing to gloat about these numbers. The recovery path is still difficult. Now let's spend some time reading this table that has been put forward by Ministry in its report. As you can see, there are 4 heads, and these 4 heads are the engines of economic growth in any economy. In Indian context, the biggest engine is consumption expenditure. In Indian context, the biggest engine is consumption demand from private individuals. It's more formally called as private final consumption expenditure. This is typically around 56% of GDP in India. The second biggest engine is the investment demand, formally called as gross fixed capital formation. This accounts for around 32% of India's GDP. The third engine is the demand for goods and services generated by the government, called as government final consumption expenditure. And the fourth engine is the demand created by net exports. Net exports meaning exports minus imports. Since India typically imports more than it exports, so it is the smallest engine and it is generally in negative. So GDP can be seen as summation of these 4 components. Consumption demand plus investment demand plus demands generated by government plus net exports. As you can see from this table, in any financial year, the private final consumption expenditure, the consumption demand, is disproportionately higher than other engines. And if you make the comparison of the number that we have now for the first quarter of current financial year, this number is comparable to what we had in the first quarter of 2017-18. This is where we stand presently. In the first quarter of 2020-2021, there was a huge slump. So you can see a big jump from here. But if you go backward in the preceding year, it was much more than what we have now. So effectively, statistically, the demand from private sector in our economy is effectively at the level of what it was in 2017-18. You must also have heard and read that government strategy has been to revive the growth by stimulating private sector's investment. And to make good on this, government has given many tax breaks and other incentives. But as you understand, because the private consumption demand is dominating in the GDP, unless this moves, the GDP will keep lagging behind. You must also take note of government's expenditure. This actually has fallen from the last quarter. And this could drag the future growth. At a time when all other sectors are struggling to create demand, the government is expected to resort to what is called as counter-cyclic fiscal policy and spend more than usual, but spending less compared to last quarter is not a good sign. Now let's quickly gaze through the GVA data. We'll make a quick comparison of the Q1 data of this financial year with the Q1 data of the year 2019-20 because it gives the idea as to where we were standing before the pandemic. The agriculture, forestry and fishing sector is doing better than what it was doing in the first quarter of 2019-20, the pre-pandemic era. Mining and quarrying is not doing better. Manufacturing not doing better. Electricity, gas, water supply, and other utility services, this head is performing better than what it used to do in the Q1 of 2019-20. If you look at the construction sector, there is considerably weakness in the sector. If you look at the construction sector, there is considerable weakness compared to Q1 of 19-20. If you look at this head, trade, hotel, transport, communication, and services related to broadcasting, it shows a worrisome picture. The performance of this head is extremely poor. What's even more worrying is the fact that these two sectors employ both skilled and unskilled workers. So a poor performance by these two sectors shows the undercurrent of unemployment. The financial services, real estate and professional services also has shown weakness. Public administration, defense and other services, this head is also showing weakness. There are only two sectors that have performed better than the pre-pandemic era: agriculture, forestry and fishing, and electricity, gas, water supply and other utility services. So much of understanding from this report will be sufficient for your exam. Now you have question of the day in front of you as well as answer to yesterday's question. Please do what you must do. Goodbye. Take care.